Good evening and welcome to our Connecticut Mirror Legislative Session Recap. I'm John Dankosky of the Connecticut Mirror, and I'm joined, as always, by my friend Mark Pazniokas, the Mirror's Capitol Bureau Chief. We're going to be taking your questions throughout our program tonight, and this program is made possible in part by the generous support of CBIA. They've been supporters of our live event series for years, and we thank them once again for their commitment to the Connecticut Mirror. I should also say that the Connecticut Mirror, as always, is nonprofit, nonpartisan, and it's very reliant on you for support. So consider a donation if you haven't already this year by just clicking that donate button in the upper right corner of the Connecticut Mirror site, ctmirror.org. It's always a good way to support the type of news and information that you get on a daily basis from the Mirror. I'm at my house in Winstead, but Mark Pazniokas is in the palatial offices of the Connecticut Mirror and joins us tonight. Mark, first of all, really good to see you.
Good to see you. And the only reason I'm not in my home office is that I have a 2-year-old visitor who has a habit of breaking into my Zoom meetings. Although he does have opinions on the fiscal guardrails, as it turns out. So we're getting that tonight.
Well, yeah, I may have some cats join me because I'm doing this from home, but probably they won't be as disruptive as that. If you have questions for Mark, and I'm sure that you will have plenty of them, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Many of you have done this before in Zoom calls. Just click the Q&A button and you can ask questions. Gabby Benedictus, who is running things at the Connecticut Mirror offices for us, is going to be compiling some of those questions and passing them along to us so that we'll get to as many of them as possible throughout the course of this hour. Again, please use the Q&A function if you could. There's also a chat which you can take part in, and a lot of people who are involved in Connecticut state policy and politics always have lively chats as we do these conversations. First of all, Paz, before we get into some of the politics, some of the policy, what was this session like for you this time? You've covered so many of them over the years. What were some of the big takeaways just personally as far as what you got out of this session?
Well, I will say it was a joy to be back in the building and have almost all the participants in the process of making legislation also in the building for really the first time since that Friday in March of 2020 when they emptied the building and said, we'll all be back Monday after a deep cleaning.
Well,
so
yeah, and did that change things? I mean, was it really good to be business, business as usual, back to it?
Yes. And there are certainly things that are now permanent. The idea of letting the public participate remotely at public hearings. I think everybody agrees that that was a lesson learned during COVID, and it was very much a step forward for public access. But, as a reporter, you lose so much when things are done remotely. There are things you learn just by walking through the corridors of walking into a public hearing, walking into a committee meeting and seeing who's there, what on the agenda has drawn people. There is the architecture of both the legislative office building and the state capitol has a certain element of transparency built into it. There tend to be ad hoc meetings in different quarters and different corridors. There are things that are certainly done out of the public view. We can get to a couple of those a little bit later. But yes, overall, it really was a joy to be back. And I think pretty much everybody would feel the same way. It's a different building. And certainly the amount of cooperation, particularly on the budget, I think is an outgrowth of people being in physical proximity to each other. Connecticut really separated itself, certainly from Washington, D.C., but from many state capitals as far as the tone of debate, the fact that there were significant bipartisan votes, particularly on the budget. But more than the bipartisanship on certain votes was the general tenor of debate, even when the parties disagreed. With some exceptions, the debates were reasonable in tone. And as somebody who's been watching, the sausage factory of cranking out legislation, I have to admit, I do take some joy in seeing that kind of, byplay.
But it has not always been such. I mean, even in Connecticut, even in a place that is far different than Washington in the way that it makes laws, we have been through, both of us, many sessions in which the tone and the tenor have not been like that. Is part of it just the personalities involved? Is part of it the proximity once again and the ability to just horse trade and talk to one another after some time being apart? To what do you attribute this this bipartisanship?
Never separate the personalities from the politics and the policy. And clearly, Governor Lamont, he is a Democrat. He has been a progressive on some issues. He's certainly supportive of some key labor things: the $15 minimum wage, paid family medical leave, reproductive rights, and he was the sponsor of a fairly comprehensive gun control bill, the first major gun legislation passed since the Sandy Hook law a decade ago. And I think that did set a tone. But he is also very much a centrist when it comes to fiscal policy, and he ran for re-election on that platform, and it was reflected in the budget. One of his biggest victories and earliest victories came in February. There was a unanimous vote to extend the so-called fiscal guidelines, some of which were adopted 6 years ago, rather, in 2017. And that really set a framework for a budget that was going to be to his liking. It had a middle-class tax cut, but it did not allow legislators to take full advantage of what for Connecticut is, an unfamiliar situation of every year having surpluses of 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. And, we don't need to get into the details of how those three caps work, other than they do guard against having spending reflect a spike in revenue. And Connecticut certainly had spike in revenue in both tax revenue and federal aid that came courtesy of ARPA. But also in the House, you have a Speaker of the House in Matt Ritter. He is the leader of a 98-member caucus. The Republicans have 53. And he is very sensitive to the differences in his caucus. He was unwilling to force votes that could be uncomfortable for some of his members. And that was frustrating for some of the progressives who believed that you could have had certain bills that if push came to shove and they had to make a choice, they would have been more green lights than red lights. And then on the Republican side, Representative Vincent Candelora, the House Republican leader, even though he is personally quite conservative, he was a member of the conservative caucus before he became the leader of the entire caucus. He is very much an institutionalist in that he is a believer in governing, and he was very much engaged. And at his direction, the Republicans were very much engaged in the budget, and that certainly makes a difference.
So I'm a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think one of the things that I know we wanted to talk about a little bit is that it's not easy to govern for Democrats with such a huge majority in the House. It seems like it should be easy, and it seems like it could be, in some people's minds, a time to be bold. But in order to protect that large coalition, to hold it together, it seems as though Matt Ritter and his colleagues have had to maybe govern in a slightly different way than you think that you would when you have such a large lead.
Bigger does not mean bolder at the Connecticut General Assembly. I think we learned that this year. And because bigger means you have people from districts that used to be solidly Republican. For example, all 3 House members from Greenwich are Democrats. You have some other Fairfield County wealthy suburban districts that are represented by Democrats. And of course, the urban coalition is Democratic coalition is still solid. And there's also, here and there are Democrats in more rural districts, including Maria Horn, who's the woman who ran the tax committee, the Finance Revenue Bonding Committee. She's from the northwest corner of Connecticut. So these things tend to moderate. You would think they would make a Democratic majority bolder, but it actually has the opposite effect. And it was maddening to some people, because when people do a vote count, the question is, does the vote count reflect who is a hard no, or does it really reflect who doesn't want to vote for the damn thing? And we certainly saw that in a couple instances, particularly an expansion of Connecticut's first in the nation paid sick days law. The governor was on board with an expansion. The Senate was on board with an even bigger expansion, but the House wouldn't pull the trigger and call a vote on the bill that the Senate sent downstairs, largely on a party line vote.
So that's one example. Maybe you can give us another example or two of things that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party at the Capitol, or progressives elsewhere in the state, might have hoped could get through this year, but just didn't see the light of day because of these very problems, I suppose, with this coalition that you've outlined already.
Well, it's not just the progressives being frustrated. There certainly were bills that more moderates would have liked to have seen. In fact, one of the bills that, the underwriter of this evening, CBIA, they very much were in favor of a law that would have eased business associations to provide healthcare coverage. And there was significant support for it. The governor certainly thought it was a good idea, but for a variety of reasons, it didn't get through. Some of them are differences in personalities. One of the key backers of that is a leader of the moderates, Representative Kerry Wood. And, bills get entangled with each other at the end of the session. So something may stand, if it was just standing alone on its own merits, might go. But then things get connected to other bills that were also supposed to go. Or again, there might be personality conflicts, and all of that goes into the machinery that cranks out legislation or doesn't crank it out.
Another thing that I think I hear you saying is that after a number of years now being in this office, the place seems to be taking on a kind of Ned Lamont sized shape. It has become a more moderate place in many ways. It seems as though from the outside that many of his priorities are indeed there. And as you said, he's touted the fact that he's been able to actually do some of the things that he ran on a few times. Is it more Ned Lamont's government than it was, a couple of years ago?
Yes, and that's an interesting question, because to be blunt, Ned Lamont is not the strongest personality I have ever seen in the Capitol, and certainly not in the governor's office. His predecessor, Dan Malloy, there was seldom a question as to what his desires were and his ability to push them through, even with thinner margins. And the fact that Dan Malloy, was elected the first time with less than 50% of the vote, and he barely got 50% the second time. Ned Lamont rolled into a second term with what, by Connecticut standards, was a landslide. He won by 13 percentage points. He is one of, the last time I checked, he is one of only 2 Democratic governors in the United States that have an approval rating of 60%. So yes, I think at some point he has prevailed, even though he does not twist arms. He did set a very, very strong limit on what would be acceptable on the budget. He would not go for anything that weakened these caps: volatility cap, spending cap, revenue cap. And even though, like Matt Ritter, who is more like Ned Lamont, is sort of a centrist in some ways, in that he reflects the breadth of his caucus, but he was pushing very much for some relief to the cap. One of the things was, so-called revenue intercept, and what that meant was he wanted to intercept some of the sales tax revenue outside the cap. The rationale was the sales tax revenue was booming in part because of inflation. So why not be able to spend a little bit more of that? So yes, I think to a degree, the governor's personality and his priorities have taken hold, and certainly the tone. I mean, he has a working relationship with the Republicans. They are not averse to criticize him, very stridently at times on his gun control bill, on some of the other things his administration stands for, including doing language that's gender neutral, which is a simple thing, but sometimes these things turn into heated debates because all it takes is a few members to take offense at referring to mothers and fathers as birth parents instead of mothers. That was something of a kerfluffle the other day. You don't get to use kerfluffle in conversations very often.
As often as you can, you should try to work it in. And again, if you have questions for Paz, there's a chance for you to do that at the bottom of the screen. There's a Q&A function. I will start to get to some of those questions in just a moment. I know that it's something that you've talked about. In some ways, one of the constituencies that Ned Lamont courts and continues to court doesn't necessarily reside in Connecticut. It's the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal. He loves it when Connecticut gets good press, but especially when it gets good press in certain places.
Very much so. Over the course of his time in office, he has often taken note when the Wall Street Journal shows signs of taking its foot off of Connecticut's figurative neck as a place to do business. And yes, there was a favorable editorial, more favorable to Governor Lamont than the political class as a whole. It suggested that he was single-handedly fighting off Democratic leaders on blowing up the various fiscal guardrails. And that, of course,
I'm sure that went well with everybody else in the building.
Well, I think they let that one go. But it's hard to say that, given that the vote in February for those caps was unanimous. Now, again, I don't want to go way deep into all that stuff, but Senator Marty Looney, the leader of the Senate, he does not really want to hear complaints about the caps, because when he tried to revise them, for instance, sort of taking out certain things like some forms of municipal aid outside of that. And he said, it's not like the cities and towns lined up behind him and lobbied for it. So, it was only when it was clear, late March into April and then into May, as to how limiting those caps would be, that you saw really the outrage, particularly when it came to reimbursements for nonprofits. There is a network of nonprofit service providers, which very much is an extension of state government. They are funded to a large degree, or in some cases almost entirely, by the state of Connecticut. And then even nursing homes, where, if you are a Medicaid patient in a nursing home, half that money is coming from Connecticut. So Connecticut, by what it offers in reimbursements, really sets labor scales. And I don't think anybody makes the case that the folks who work in nursing homes and group homes for disabled folks are being underpaid. And that was the real test of values, I think, this session, was the governor's desire to have Connecticut seen as fiscally stable, as a place where businesses should look to expand, versus using that surplus money to raise wages on folks who, like I said, I think clearly deserve higher wages. By the way, in defense of the governor on that, I will add that when you do pay down pension debt, there is an immediate value because the annual contribution you have to do. So Lamont's argument is, over time, that is good for all these services that Connecticut is providing. It will free up more money in the general fund budget, but it takes time, and there is a desire to do something more dramatically now on those wages.
Yeah, and to this point, one of the questions coming in is from Kathy. It says, not that I want to return to the days of recessions and deficits, but really wonder whether the governor understands the impact of strict adherence to the fiscal guardrails on services provided by community nonprofits and those that they serve. You you just lined something out there, Paz, which is important, is that long term, some of these fiscal guardrails can provide important savings to the state that will long term be good for these services. Is it an either or, though? I mean, can we be, and I'm sure that this is quite a bit of the debate, can we be fiscally prudent and still provide what's necessary for people who are doing this very hard work, especially coming out of a couple of years of really, really hard work during COVID?
Well, despite what I said at the top about the willingness of the various parties to work together, the middle ground on so many things is a difficult place to work in American politics. And, the governor's response to what you just said would be, if you yield significant ground now, given that Connecticut had been awful for 30, 40, my friend and colleague Keith Faniff would say it goes back to the 1940s or beyond, that Connecticut's failure to adequately support its pension fund. So the governor's position is, I'm going to be kind of a hard ass on that and stick to it. And there will be benefits. But there are strong cases about unmet needs, and that is the classic debate over values. I don't know if that debate was vigorous enough or perhaps public enough. I mean, the governor was certainly public in his positions, and the union, for example, who represents the striking group home workers, 1199, was certainly clear. But that was the part that, that was the struggle throughout the year about how do you meet, those are both valid, I would say, public policy positions. Lamont's position on Connecticut's long history of fiscal mismanagement and irresponsibility really cannot be denied. On the other hand, we have unmet needs. We have them today, and Connecticut right now has more money than it's willing to spend on those services.
Speaking of these fiscal guardrails, Alex asks, did the bipartisanship on the budget guardrails go too far when they were adopted unanimously without any public hearing, but the impact of the guardrails was regretted by the end of the session? I'll parenthetically say, at least by some. Should bipartisanship be accepted as an alternative to public hearings? Thank you, says Alex.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it's a question that I certainly pose to the governor and to certain legislators. Do you have any buyer's regret? And, when I asked Tony Walker, the representative from New Haven, who is the co-chair of appropriations and certainly has a big heart when it comes to folks in need, I asked her that, and because they would talk about, there's a learning curve. So, there's a learning curve. If you know then what you know now, would you have voted for that? And she refused to answer that question, which is unusual for Tony Walker. She usually will answer whatever is asked. But yeah, that was something that was done quickly. It was done in February, and as I recall, it was an emergency certified bill, which means it bypasses the normal, public hearing process. And by the way, there's nothing magic. And we had a conversation with the governor at Real Artways. It was a public event. And I sort of pressed him on to the degree to which he's looked into the inner workings of how those caps work, because even the people who drafted them, I think, would be the first to admit there's nothing magical about those formulas. There's a volatility cap, which, Connecticut, because the state relies so much on the income tax, and so much of the income tax revenue comes from Fairfield County, and so much of Fairfield County relies on Wall Street, where it goes up and down. The volatility cap, I think, most people would agree, made a lot of sense. Smooth out the highs and lows, because even when you provide more funding, you don't want to take it away 2 years later, right? You increase nursing home reimbursements, or you do what they didn't do this year, but there's a pressure to eventually do, which is raise Medicaid reimbursement rates for, say, specialists, because folks of limited means who get their health insurance through Medicaid, which is called Husky in Connecticut, they can have a hard time getting an appointment with a specialist. So, Alex, that's a great question. And it really was a fundamental one about what is the political identity right now of Connecticut, as well as the values of this governor and this General Assembly.
We've got a bunch of questions coming in about a variety of topics, but three different people have asked about, and they put it three different ways. The bill about aid in dying, or physician-assisted suicide, or death with dignity, depending on how you decide to phrase that. This is something that we've been talking about for some time. What happened with that legislation this year?
Short answer is not much. It did not really go far down the road. That's a bill that has trouble getting out of committee at times. And when it does get out of public health, one time it didn't get out of judiciary. So that was really not a factor. It was eliminated as a contender for passage very early in the session.
We have a couple questions here, including from our friend Bilal, who is Bilal Saku, who's a board member of the Connecticut Mirror, also professor at University of Hartford. It says, proponents of access to housing through fair share won a very partial victory. Do you anticipate any future legislative breakthrough that would give families from places like Hartford access to affordable housing in high opportunity communities in the suburbs? We have a few questions about housing policy, and this is something that, frankly, Paz, once again, much like aid in dying, comes up every session, comes up every year. What happened this time around?
The difference between housing issue and, say, aid in dying is there is a large constituency to do something. There is an incredibly broad consensus that this state is woefully short of affordable housing, and it's a problem for businesses. It's a problem for municipalities who are trying to employ teachers, cops, firefighters. And it's a problem for people of limited, not even just limited means, of really middle-class folks who it's a struggle to get housing here. All right, so that's the consensus. Now the question is, what do you do? So this governor has put significant funding available, which will help develop affordable housing, but it doesn't do anything to confront suburbs where multifamily housing is either not allowed at all. It's not in their zoning code is a matter of right. And by the way, multifamily housing is in this state is defined as 3 or more units. So the hard thing on this is, if you're going to nudge the suburbs over the zoning issues as opposed to the expense issues, because even if you resolve zoning challenges, expensive land is expensive land. And that's, one of the things that will always be there, which is why you need public subsidy to blend it with private money and bring down the cost and bring down the rents. But there was, without leadership from the governor, or the leaders of the caucuses, you're not going to see that. That in my view, in my analysis, that requires somebody staking out a very clear position and pursuing it. And that means whipping votes, which is just legislative talk for leaning on folks and trying to build a coalition. There was no coalition around an approach. Take, for example, CBIA would love to see more housing, but I saw no evidence of CBIA being involved in pushing towns to change their zoning. When it comes to affordable housing, you also have to ask the question of the various groups, because there are several. What is your primary goal? Is it the production of affordable housing? Is it the production of affordable housing in places that do not have economic or racial diversity? Because that's a different thing. There are there are certainly communities that have industrial buildings ready to be redone, have commercial buildings. Hartford has done that very successfully with support from state money. But that's one of the tensions here. One of the groups is called Desegregate Connecticut. So is your goal to desegregate Connecticut, or is your goal to build as much affordable housing wherever you can get it? And I don't mean to make light of it, but there's overlap on those two very worthy goals, but they can be exclusive at times when it comes to the question of zoning in some of these suburbs. And this governor clearly has no stomach to take that fight on. I think that's very clear.
I should say, just by way of disclosure, that yes, indeed, CBIA is sponsoring this evening's event. Hi, folks. And thank you very much for, as always, supporting the work that we do here at the Connecticut Mirror. Taking some more of your questions here, a lot more for Mark Pazniokas as we wrap up the 2023 legislative session. Amongst the many things that I heard from people in these last couple of weeks, people that I know, Paz, who came up to me, folks who are involved in environmental issues said, not a whole heck of a lot got done this year, huh? And much like some of the questions around social services, they're pointing some fingers at the governor, certainly. What happened exactly in terms of environmental policy this time around, given the fact that there are so many pressing environmental problems happening? It was noted by many people that the session was wrapping up amidst a fog and haze coming from the wildfires in Canada, engulfing the Northeast in noxious fumes. What exactly happened with environmental policy this time around?
Well, the governor's administration did act aggressively on a couple elements of environmental legislation. There was fairly ambitious legislation on what to do about the disposal of municipal solid waste. Connecticut, with the closure of a waste-to-energy plant in Hartford last year, there are only 3 waste-to-energy plants, burn plants that generate electricity by burning trash. There are no landfills that take municipal solid waste. So this state ships 860,000 tons of trash by train and by truck to the Midwest. And
that's a lot of trash.
It's a lot of trash. And obviously there's environmental implications in just shipping it. Now trains are more environmentally sensitive than trucks, assuming they don't derail with large tanks of chemicals, but
exactly.
But that's still cheaper than using these very aging burn plants. So the administration tried to do a number of things. Look at how to reduce the waste stream by packaging. There's something called EPR, which is basically putting it's environmental production. I don't know. I am totally. Oh, extended producer responsibility. It just popped in.
There we go.
Yes,
I was about to Google it.
And we have extended producer responsibility on some very narrow product lines, right? There's no safe way to get rid of old paint in your bins. So there's a way you bring it back to your local recycling center, and the paint industry takes care of it because you paid a little extra when you bought your gallon of paint. And that's the simplification of it. The administration was putting forward a broader, very ambitious thing about how can you do a system like that for all solid waste, basically. And one of the questions was, would you give up control over recycling? This is a hybrid system. It's, we municipalities in the state pay certain money to get this going, but, in the Hartford area, there's a recycling sorting plant that a private company put $40 million into it. And, they get tip fees for it, but they also sell the stuff they sort. And they need a guaranteed flow of stuff they can recycle and sell. Otherwise, they lose their shirt on that. And that is one of the tensions. The Lamont administration also wanted to impose basically a fee to create a cash flow for a variety of reasons, to fund the next generation of how we're going to get rid of our waste, whether it's going to be newer, cleaner burn plants, that generate energy, or some other technology. And anything that costs money regarding this was very controversial. So it's not that the governor's office and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection didn't try. In fact, there was an effort to resurrect a bill that could not get through the Environment Committee intact and stick it into the budget, which is sort of the final, the last chance to do that. You put in something that may be unpopular with something that is popular, such as middle-class tax cuts that were in the budget. But that didn't fly. On climate,
Yeah.
Again, anything that costs money, it has trouble. But the thing that was odd this year, and again, this is where I think personalities come into it. The House did pass a bill, and it was, it had a couple of names. It was called a roadmap to decarbonization or zero emissions policy. But here's the thing. It didn't impose anything. It really set in motion, again, a roadmap. The Department of Energy and Environmental Protection would be ordered to start to produce this kind of map beginning in 2025. And so it wasn't anything that gave the Commissioner of Energy and Environmental Protection, superhero powers. But just the very, some of the language in there, it did declare a climate crisis, not state of emergency, which has certain legal aspects where it allows a governor to bypass things. But it passed the House. It passed the House on party lines, and it just sat in the Senate. So the question is why? There were certainly enough Democrats to pass that. Was the environmental co-chair lukewarm about it? In the Senate, they give great deference to committee chairs, and sometimes that gums up the works as well. You may have a committee chair that's less than enthused about bringing out a certain bill and defending it, and sometimes that's all it takes to have it die from inaction. But and the other element here, it's a larger problem for the administration and for environmentalists in general, is that Katie Dykes, the Commissioner of Energy and Environmental Protection, has, I believe, a very difficult relationship with the legislature. There is not a lot of trust in anything that gives her department more power. You see pushback. It's very public. It's very visible. And
What's it about? Is it about personality? Is it about the overall aims of that department, a very large, expensive, important department that oversees both the energy sector, or at least a big part of it, and also environmental regulation?
I think it's all of it. And you can, again, you never can separate personalities and relationships from the policy. And so here's an example. And this is, in hindsight, it's kind of a silly thing, but it's instructive of Commissioner Dykes' difficulties with the General Assembly. When the legislature expanded the bottle bill, the way it was written, to me, the language was very clear. It applied to a bunch of new things, including hard seltzers. Okay, a can is a can, right? This stuff comes in a can. But the legislators were quite clear in the debate as far as legislative intent that, there nothing produced by the wine and spirits corner of the folks who make booze has ever been covered by the bottle bill, and there's no infrastructure for it. So it was quite clear that the hard seltzers that have either wine or spirits in them, as opposed to malt beverages, that they would not be covered by the bottle bill. But as I said, the plain language was, they're covered. Instead of informing the legislature that for me not to apply the bottle bill to those hard seltzers, you're going to have to change the law. Instead of doing that, they put out a notice to merchants that they would be collecting a 10-cent deposit on hard seltzer. And, it's a little thing, but it really annoyed lawmakers. And I would say it was a political misstep on the part of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And in fact, the fix was a 12-word sentence that defined more clearly what the legislature, quite frankly, should have done the first time, define more clearly.
Well, there is that. Maybe you just write the language the right way.
And sometimes at the legislature, you can be right. And Katie Dykes was right on interpreting what the plain language was. But I think you could argue she was politically wrong and responded to it. And again, it's one of the things that they pay a price for. I think there is a consensus that Commissioner Dykes is brilliant. She is farsighted in her views of the challenges facing Connecticut and the rest of the world on climate change, on climate resilience. We certainly have a significant coastline in Connecticut on the Sound, and we also have streams and rivers that periodically spill over their banks. But unfortunately, there is that tension there. Her confirmation, because when a governor starts a new term, his people are up again. And Republicans blocked her confirmation to send a message for quite a while. And it was only after they fixed the very important issue of hard seltzer deposits that they deigned to give the commissioner her confirmation vote.
We have a bunch of questions, really good questions coming in from folks in the Q&A here. And so I want to get to as many of them as we can. So we'll blow through a few things. Some more stuff that specifically happened at the end of the session, but our friend Doobie has a question for you. Could Paz talk about how GOP elected officials in the legislature are handling the Trump thing? It was great to see bipartisan cooperation, but there's this sort of wonder about whether or not you're going to get primaried if you get too cozy with the Dems, with the libs,
I think both parties are amazed that who right now who is a front runner in both parties. You have a Democrat who would be 86 at the end of his second term, and you have a Republican who is under indictment in New York State as well as federal government. And yeah, they do their best to stay away from it. I don't sense any great love or any great desire among elected officials, elected Republicans in the General Assembly. There is very much a desire for Donald Trump to just go away, but he is so problematic for them because every poll I've seen indicates that a Republican who denounces him, there's an issue. You do have, again, a significant part of the Republican base who remains loyal to Donald Trump. And it's very easy to say, why aren't you being bolder? But, that's just the political reality. I think, certainly after the Biden victory, we had some Republican leaders who were quite clear in breaking with Donald Trump. Vinnie Candelora among them, the House Republican leader. He said pretty soon after the election, he said, it's over. If there was fraud, it was not fraud significant enough to call the results into question. Let's move on. And he said that, I believe, in November, immediately afterwards. And he certainly didn't change his tune after the January 6th insurrection. Themis Claridis, the former House Republican leader, had a similar position. And she was public in that she did not vote for Trump's reelection. And that cost her a win in a primary when she ran for U.S. Senate. So it's a tough spot, and it's going to be a tough spot for Republicans, and particularly in any state, really, because the base is still with Trump to a statistically significant degree.
Since we're talking about elections, more public money is now available to run for governor. And that's an interesting outgrowth of this session. Does this mean the end of all these self-funding candidates that we've had over the course of the last decade or so?
It's an experiment, what they're doing. It's not the self-funders. That's not an experiment. But in the idea of trying to figure—
It's been going great for Republicans in the state, by the way, that experiment. But go ahead. Yes, please continue.
The current governor, as I recall, is a Democrat who spent a lot of his money.
He did.
Winning the office, winning re-election, as well as on unsuccessful runs for United States Senate and previously for governor. So we do have that. So what they did, there were two problems with public financing. So public, to just sort of remind folks, anybody who's tuning into this probably knows what it is, but if you qualify for public financing, you agree to strict spending limits and you get a lot of public money. You have to raise certain seed money to show that you're a credible candidate, and you have to have a place on the ballot. So it's hugely popular, people in both parties, for every office except governor. And Bob Stefanowski taught us 4 years ago that early spending, if you are a self-funder, you can do early spending. The publicly financed people really can't do. So Bob Stefanowski, who was the Republican candidate for Republican nominee for governor 4 years ago and again last year, he did $1.5 million in early spending, went on TV, and he came out of nowhere. I mean, this is a guy who didn't even vote until he became a candidate. And so it was a pretty extraordinary thing. And his competitors who were publicly financed really didn't get significant money until June. And by that point, it was over. So what they're doing is they're doubling the grant. The public grant for a general election would be somewhere north of 15 million. I think 8 million for primary. But the interesting thing is there's a new grant. It would be a pre-convention grant. So that's an acknowledgement of, if you're going to be public finance, you need some money in those early months. So to qualify for it, you still have to raise the seed money, which is not insignificant. To run for governor, it's going to be close to $300,000 you have to raise. So I think we will see people who want to be publicly financed will start early. Maybe, I don't know what time. As soon as well, that law was signed in because it was attached to a secondary bill. But so that's the experiment. Will that give you enough money to compete? Now, money is not the be all and end all. You need a certain amount of money to be credible to get your message out. But Dan Malloy beat two self-funders in 2010. He beat Ned Lamont in a primary and Tom Foley in the general election. And Linda McMahon spent $50 million twice, once against Dick Blumenthal and once against Chris Murphy for open Senate seats, and didn't get it done. In fact, her numbers were not hugely different from what's the kind of the base Republican vote. So, like I said, it is an experiment. When they launched public financing campaigns after the Rowland scandal, it was very much an experiment as to how it would work. And when it comes to certainly electing the General Assembly, I think it is certainly freed lawmakers of reliance on lobbyists for money and on their own leadership PACs. Leadership PACs were almost totally reliant on lobbyists. So it's really changed the dynamic at the General Assembly. I don't think anybody would dispute that. And it's also opened the field to who can run. So it's, I think there's been a lot of good, but is it still relevant in the race for governor? We'll find out in 3 years.
Also in election news, interestingly, it seemed as though Connecticut might make a move to move up its primary, and somehow that didn't happen. Yeah. How did that not happen?
That's a great question. And it should have been easy. The interesting thing, there were two things in that bill. So the bill was, and this is a bill supported by the Republican state party chair, the Democratic state party chair, and then the Democrat who happens to be governor right now. So you would think that's a layup, right? And all it did was move Connecticut's presidential primary from the last Tuesday in April to the first Tuesday in April, right? No muss, no fuss. Now, the other part of that bill that Ben Proto, the Republican chair, and Nancy DiNardo, the Democratic chair, was to raise the limits on what you can give state parties from $10,000. That was is now the maximum contribution to $15,000. Interestingly enough, that piece of that bill was tucked into another aircraft carrier of a bill that kind of took on all kinds of things at the end. But for whatever reason, nobody thought to add the primary date change, and why they couldn't pass that, because it did have bipartisan support. is really a mystery. I asked the governor that question when he had a ceremonial bill signing for early voting, and he turned to the chairs of the Government Administration Elections Committee, particularly May Flexer, the senator, because it was, I believe it was a Senate bill. He goes, yeah. He goes, what happened there? And there were no answers offered to them.
So for all of the little things that get tucked into the big bill at the end that we, bitch and moan about, and we're like, how did that get in there? This is one that probably could have and should have, and everyone thought it was going to, and it just didn't.
You would
Interesting. Early voting, though.
Early voting, the only controversy was really, is there sufficient money for the municipalities? And the other controversy was it didn't get as many Republican votes as it would have if it had been a more modest start. And they are starting with 14 days of early voting as opposed to Secretary of State Stephanie Thomas's recommendation based on a study to do 10 days. It's going to be a burden for the smaller towns, certainly. You could have done 10 days, which would cover 2 weekends. There was a fair amount of nonsense about security and stuff. This is not new. These early cast ballots will be handled the same way absentee ballots are now, the ones that are returned by mail or returned in person. And it's well overdue in Connecticut. We are one of the last 4 states that does not allow some form of early voting. And the reason, of course, was our Constitution was unusually prescriptive on the hours and days of voting, as well as the use of absentee ballots. So a constitutional amendment did pass overwhelmingly, I might add. So we are, if we're not cutting edge, we're at least, well into the 21st century.
At least in the 20th century. You had mentioned the comprehensive gun control bill, the first really signed after the Sandy Hook provisions that came in years ago. Maybe you can just very quickly walk through what exactly is in there. How transformative is any of this? We also had a question from Richard about the plans of those opposed to the gun violence prevention law to file a lawsuit against it.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be challenged. The gun control law, I mean, politically, it was one of Lamont's victories. He actually did also negotiate some healthcare cost containment stuff, not as ambitious as he wanted, but I think they did set in motion some things that we should at least acknowledge that could control costs. But the gun thing, it was comprehensive as far as the breadth of what it tackled. So it strengthened the current ban on AR-15s and similar rifles. It closed a loophole that allowed pre-ban AR-15s to be purchased still. There was really no enforceable ban on the large capacity magazines that were passed in Sandy Hook. So that was tightened. It bans open carry. It does not ban carry. It does not affect who can be permitted. People, as the gun safety or gun control folks would quickly point out, that even though Connecticut is generally considered as the 4th, 5th, or 6th safest state, or with strongest states for gun laws, people own lots and lots of guns, and that's still legal. The open carry ban, it really was not a big issue here, but in some parts of the country, you would see people being deliberately provocative, walking into a shopping mall with an AR-15 strapped over their shoulder, or a handgun either tucked into their waistband or in a holster. And so you will have to, if you have a permit to carry a firearm in Connecticut, it's still valid. It will remain valid, but you gotta conceal it, There were things for there was more gun safe storage stuff. There was something for gun owners in there. There are some cities that are very slow in acting on what's called the suitability investigation for permit applicants. So this set kind of a tighter deadline, and if the cities don't meet the current timeline and a little bit more time passes, they can go right to the state police, which is now the final thing, which is really, if you don't have a record and the local cops haven't said you're unsuitable, Connecticut is a shall issue state. And by the way, that has legal applications, because when people look at the Supreme Court's case against in New York, did not have the same kind of structure Connecticut does. So that's why Connecticut people think this law is defensible, even with the new guidelines set by the U.S. Supreme Court.
We have just a couple minutes left. We got a bunch of questions that are kind of like structural questions about the way that things get done. Lori asks, lawmakers often claim the clock ran out or there was just not enough time to address many bills. Why is leadership so willing to allow unending filibusters when so many bills are awaiting action? It's something that we've certainly talked about in the past. Paz, I don't know if anything to tag on to Lori's question. I don't know if there's anything new in the way that the legislature works now, post-COVID, back in the building here, that maybe could point to changes in this, but we seem to be back in the same place, right? Where everything gets done at the very end and then things don't get done. We don't have more time.
And it is one of the moderating influences in legislating in Connecticut, because the balance of power shifts at the end. Any legislator who is willing to stand up and talk endlessly, you can in effect kill a bill. And we certainly saw that attempt on the last day by Senator Rob Sampson, who spoke for hours on end in opposition to the affordable housing bill that did pass. It wasn't as strong as what the advocates wanted, but there were things in there, that certain protections for tenants against evictions and certain other things that I think people agreed were good public policy. And that was a 9-hour debate on the very last day. So there's a couple of things at work here. First off, you have to view the legislature like a big funnel, and everything starts, almost everything, unless it gets emergency certification that we talked about earlier, it goes through the committees, in some cases, multiple committees. And if there's significant funds involved, it's probably not going to pass before there's a budget. So that means there's a whole bunch of stuff sitting on the House and Senate calendars in the final days, and they're all vulnerable. And some people would argue that's not a bad thing. It tends to moderate a legislature. It tends to push them towards incremental steps that may be frustrating to the people who want them, but ultimately put a state on a deliberate path. And, there are certainly exceptions. The gun bill was a partisan bill that the governor pushed and the Democratic leadership pushed, and it got through without any problem. But yeah, it is one of the things that's maddening to people, because unlike Congress, when you hit midnight on the constitutional adjournment deadline day, it's all done. I mean, the work is not completely wasted in that you can take the material and refile, but it's not like Congress where you have 2 years to pass a bill. But that's different. And again, there are differences of opinion as to whether or not that actually is good for legislating if you take a long haul view of things, as frustrating as it could be when it's your bill and you're asking, why didn't it pass?
Yeah, there's so many more things that we could tackle. It was obviously a very busy legislative session. We got a ton of great questions, as always, from our listeners and viewers. So thank you so much for those. Mark Pazniokas, the Capitol Bureau Chief of the Connecticut Mirror. Always good to talk to you, Paz. Take a well-deserved break. Go to the Cape or something.
It's a good idea.
I think you should. Mark Pazniokas, as always, reports on the Capitol because of support from people just like you who really love the Connecticut Mirror, love policy and politics, want to know what's happening at the Capitol, not just in events like this, but when you get a chance to read Mark and Keith and all of their colleagues on a daily basis. Donate to support this vital news. Go to that little red button in the upper right-hand corner of the ctmirror.org page and make your contribution today. I want to thank our sponsor for today's event, CBIA. They've been so generous to us, not just this year, but through many years, especially of doing these Zoom events over the course of the last couple of years. Thank you to CBIA for supporting this work. Thanks again to audience engagement specialist, Gabby DeBenedictis. Damn it, Gabby. I always mess up your name. I'm so sorry. You ran the show tonight, and thank you so much for that. Thanks to publisher Bruce Potterman, executive editor Beth Hamilton, and thanks to everyone who joined us tonight. I'm John Dankosky. We'll see you again soon.